The first thing Ethan Cole noticed was not the morning light, not the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs of coastal Maine, but a smell. And oh, what a smell it was. Not the fresh, salty breeze he had expected, no. It was something foul, something rancid, something that clung to the very air around him like an invisible curse. It was the stench of decay, the smell of death. He stirred on a velvet sofa, his body heavy, every muscle aching as if he had been wrung out like a rag. For a moment, confusion clouded his thoughts. Where am I? This wasn't his rundown apartment back in Portland. This wasn't the back seat of a borrowed car where he sometimes passed out after long nights. No, he was inside an old mansion, its curtains drawn so tightly that only a thin blade of gray morning light cut across the parlor. And that smell, dear God, that smell, was stronger here. Acrid, nauseating. It clung to his skin, his clothes, his very breath. He tried to sit up, but his chest felt heavy, his head pounded with a relentless rhythm, and his mouth was as dry as sandpaper. Then, with a jolt of terror, the memories of last night came flooding back. Her, Margaret Halloway, 71 years old, a woman with silver hair pinned in a regal bun, her eyes glimmering like polished stones under the candlelight. She wasn't just any woman. No, she was something else, something more. Ethan remembered the crimson robe she wore, the golden sash, the way her hand had guided him with chilling certainty. He remembered the strange wine she made him drink, thick, metallic, almost bitter on his tongue. He remembered her whispers, words in a language he could not understand. And he remembered her voice in his ear, urging him to keep going, to push himself past the limits of his strength, even as his body screamed for rest. Hours had blurred into a feverish dream, a night that felt endless, unreal, and yet horrifyingly vivid. And now? Now the mansion was silent. Too silent. Ethan's stomach churned as dread coiled in his gut. He glanced around the room, at the shadows pooling in the corners, at the heavy drapes that seemed to smother the morning light, at the empty decanter of dark red liquid spilled on the carpet like blood. Something was wrong. Terribly, irreversibly wrong. Because when Ethan looked down at himself, he froze. His breath caught in his throat. A tremor ran through his hands as he clutched at his clothes. And then, the horrifying truth dawned upon him. The stench was not coming from the house. It wasn't from the old sofa. It was coming from him. From his body. From down there. Oh God. His skin. His flesh. Something was happening. Something that should never happen to a living man. And as the morning light crept higher across that old mansion, Ethan Cole realized with sickening clarity, last night had not been a night of passion. It had been a trap, a curse, a slow, rotting death, and he was the victim. Ethan Cole, 25 years old, 6 feet tall, a jawline that seemed carved from stone and eyes that danced somewhere between mischief and charm. To most people who saw him on the streets of Portland, Maine, he looked like a young man destined for something. The kind of guy who could walk into any bar and own the room without even trying. Women noticed him, older women especially, and Ethan knew it. But beneath that polished surface, beneath the confident grin and the swagger of someone who always seemed to have a story, his life was hollow, empty, a facade, polished just enough to hide the cracks. Ethan had been a restless soul from the very beginning. He'd dropped out of community college after only one semester, convincing himself that school wasn't for him. Why waste years chasing a degree when he could live life? Or so he told himself. But the truth was far less glamorous. His jobs came and went like seasons, bartending here, construction there, bouncing at nightclubs when cash ran thin. None of it stuck. He drifted from paycheck to paycheck, never staying long enough to build stability, never caring enough to try. And yet, Ethan had one undeniable gift, himself. His body, his youth, his charm. On dating apps, his profile lit up the screens of women twice his age. Widows in penthouses, lonely executives in hotel suites, thrill seekers who wanted a taste of danger in the arms of a younger man. Ethan was all too eager to play the part. Flash a grin. Say the right words. Let them feel desired again. And in return, doors opened. Cash slipped into his pocket. Nights and places he had no business being. He bragged to his friends about it, of course. Not everything. Never the details that made him sound desperate. To them, he was living the high life. Cougars, he'd say with a laugh, raising a drink. They can't resist me. His friends would cheer, envious, while Ethan soaked in their admiration like it was proof that he mattered. But the truth? When the lights dimmed and the laughter faded, Ethan sat alone in cheap apartments with peeling paint and broken blinds. He drowned emptiness in whiskey, waking up hungover, scrolling again, searching for the next adventure. Because that's what he called it, adventure. Not prostitution, not desperation, but adventure. Stories. Something to brag about, something to make him feel alive. He told himself he was smarter than the other guys in town, that while they were stuck in dead-end jobs and early marriages, he was out chasing thrills, making memories. But deep down, Ethan knew better. He was lonely, utterly, achingly lonely. His father had vanished before he even hit high school. His mother worked 2 jobs, too exhausted to notice when Ethan started slipping. Love, in his world, had always felt like a transaction. Something earned, something fragile, something you lost the moment you couldn't give enough back. So he leaned into performance. If he couldn't have love, he'd have desire. If he couldn't have permanence, he'd have fleeting moments of power. But at 25, he was already tired. Though he'd never admit it, the endless cycle of chasing, drinking, performing, it was wearing him down. Some nights, when he was sober just long enough to think clearly, he caught himself wondering how long it could last. How long until his looks faded? Until his body gave out? Until the stories ran dry? In those rare, quiet moments, Ethan felt the truth claw at him. He was playing a dangerous game, and games always end. Still, the lure of easy money was impossible to resist. His phone was never far from his hand. Swipe after swipe, night after night. Each profile was a potential story, another shot of adrenaline to fill the void inside him. And that Thursday evening, sprawled on his couch, he almost tossed the phone aside in boredom. The faces blurred together, filters and fakes, the occasional bot. Until he saw her. The profile name was simple, Margaret, 71. No attempt to disguise her age. No grainy selfie from decades ago. No glamorous lie. Just a candid photo. Silver hair swept into a bun, standing by a stone fireplace. A silk shawl draped across her shoulders. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, seemed to pierce right through the screen. Beneath the picture, one line of text. Are you interested in a different kind of night? Different. That word made his pulse quicken. Ethan chuckled to himself, ready to swipe past. But something about the photo, something about those eyes. They didn't ask. They commanded. He hesitated. His thumb hovered over the screen. He typed back. Depends what you mean by different. The reply came instantly. I'll make it worth your while, $1,000. Cash. One night. My home is by the coast. If you're brave enough, come after midnight. Ethan sat upright, wide awake. $1,000? That was more than he'd made in the past 3 weeks combined. Usually, the women slipped him a few hundred, maybe covered dinner, maybe bought him something small. But this was serious money. Rent, debts, party cash, all in one night. For a moment, doubt flickered. Why would a 71-year-old widow pay so much for one night with a stranger? Why him? But the thought didn't last long. Greed, curiosity, ego, they drowned out reason. And in that instant, Ethan Cole made the decision that would seal his fate. Because he wasn't just walking into a stranger's mansion. He was walking into the arms of a predator. And she had been waiting for him all along. The notification lit up Ethan Cole's phone at 9:07 p.m. He was sprawled on his sagging couch, half drunk, mindlessly swiping through profiles he'd seen 100 times before. But this one stopped him cold. Margaret, 71. The same silver-haired woman, the same fireplace photo, the same piercing eyes. Her message was short, but it struck him like a hook through the ribs. $1,000. One night. Come after midnight. I'll be waiting. Ethan blinked. Surely this was a scam. No one was that bold, that direct. But then the second message appeared, as if she knew he needed a push. I'll pay in cash. No questions asked. My mansion is by the coast. If you're brave enough, come. A mansion. By the cliffs. $1,000. His heart raced. He sat up, suddenly sober. This was everything he craved rolled into one. Money, danger, a story too wild for even his friends to believe. And yet something gnawed at him. Why the secrecy? Why midnight? Why such a large sum for a single night? But Ethan had never been good at listening to doubt. Curiosity drowned it out. Greed silenced it completely. At 11:30 p.m., he showered, shaved, and dressed with unusual care. His best black shirt, tight enough to show off his build. Dark jeans, polished shoes. He doused himself in cologne, too much, as though preparing for a performance. He slid a flask of whiskey into his jacket pocket, along with a small pack of condoms. Prepared for anything, he told himself with a grin in the mirror. By midnight, his car was crawling along a narrow coastal road. The trees thickened, branches blotting out the moonlight. The ocean roared somewhere in the distance, a sound both exhilarating and unnerving. And then, at last, he saw it. The mansion. It rose from the cliffs like something carved out of shadow and stone. Tall arched windows glowed faintly, their light spilling into the night like watchful eyes. An iron gate stood open as if it had been waiting for him. Ethan pulled into the gravel drive, his tires crunching on the stones. The air smelled different here, sharp salt from the sea, mixed with something older, muskier, like incense burned long ago and never quite faded. His stomach fluttered, not entirely from nerves. Before he could even knock, the front door creaked open. And there she was, Margaret Halloway. She stood framed in the doorway, wrapped in a crimson silk robe cinched with a golden sash. Her silver hair gleamed under the lantern light, pulled back in a bun so neat it looked sculpted. Her lips were painted deep wine red, and her eyes, sharp, unblinking, locked onto his with unnerving intensity. "You came," she said softly. Her voice was low, melodic, almost hypnotic. Ethan forced a grin, trying to steady his breath. "You said you'd make it worth my while." Her lips curved, slow and deliberate, though her smile never touched her eyes. She stepped aside, one pale hand sweeping gracefully toward the darkness within. "Then come in, Ethan. The night is waiting." He hesitated just a heartbeat. Something deep inside him whispered don't. But then he crossed the threshold. The foyer stretched before him, vast and grand, lined with oil paintings of faces he did not recognize. Their painted eyes seemed to follow him, cold and knowing. Candles flickered on ornate tables, their flames bending in the draft, shadows writhing across the walls. The air smelled faintly sweet, spiced with something he couldn't place. It was comforting and unsettling all at once, like perfume masking something rotten underneath. "Drink?" Margaret asked, gliding toward a carved side table. She poured from a crystal decanter into two delicate glasses. The liquid inside shimmered dark red, thicker than any wine he'd seen. She handed one to him. Her fingers, cool and firm, lingered against his skin. Ethan sniffed the drink. It didn't smell like wine. It smelled earthier, heavier, almost metallic. "What is this?" he asked. "An old recipe," she said, lifting her own glass. "It keeps me young." Ethan chuckled nervously and tossed the liquid back in one swallow. It burned as it slid down, spreading heat through his chest. Strange, bitter, almost alive. Margaret watched him closely, her expression unreadable. Then, with that same unnerving grace, she took his hand and led him deeper into the house. The oak doors shut heavily behind him, echoing like a final verdict. Ethan felt a tremor ripple down his spine. The night was no longer just an adventure, no longer just a story for his friends. It was something else. And as Margaret's voice floated softly through the candlelit halls, whispering words he didn't understand, Ethan realized one chilling truth. He was no longer in control. The parlor glowed in gold and shadow. A low fire crackled, its light reflecting against crystal glassware and the polished wood of ancient furniture. Margaret Halloway moved with an elegance Ethan could not ignore, not the fragile shuffle of an elderly woman, but the fluid grace of someone decades younger. Every step of her crimson robe whispered across the floor like a secret. She handed him another glass. "Drink," she urged softly, her tone so calm, so commanding that refusal felt impossible. Ethan hesitated, just for a moment. Something about her voice tugged at him, almost like invisible strings pulling against his will. He obeyed. The strange liquid burned his throat, then spread a warmth so sudden, so powerful, he gasped. His veins hummed, his skin tingled, his chest tightened with an intensity that felt both intoxicating and terrifying. Margaret sipped slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "Tell me," she asked, her voice like silk wrapping around his ears. "Do you believe some nights can change a man forever?" Ethan forced a laugh, though his heart raced unevenly. "I guess we'll see." Her smile widened, But her eyes, oh, those eyes, remained cold, unreadable, hungry. She set her glass aside, then slipped the golden sash from her robe. The crimson fabric loosened, falling open with deliberate slowness. For a moment, Ethan forgot to breathe. Not because she was old, but because she wasn't. At least, not entirely. The firelight painted her skin pale, luminous, smooth in places where time should have carved its marks. And in that surreal glow, she radiated a confidence so magnetic he couldn't look away. Her age became irrelevant. She wasn't fragile. She was powerful, unyielding, in control. She drew closer. Her hands, cool and unshaking, slid across his chest. "Give yourself," she whispered. Ethan obeyed. At first, it was lust, pure, reckless desire. But soon, it blurred into something else, something darker. Every time he thought he was spent, she pressed him further. "Again," she murmured. "Don't stop. Not yet." Her nails bit into his back, sharp enough to sting. Her breath against his ear carried words he couldn't recognize, strange syllables, rhythmic, almost like a chant. And then the room seemed to respond. The fire flared, its flames snapping as if feeding on their bodies. Candles flickered violently, shadows twisting against the walls, bending into grotesque shapes. Ethan blinked, sweat dripping into his eyes, certain he saw figures moving. Thin, skeletal forms lurking in the corners, hollow eyes staring. He turned his head, and they vanished. "Just your mind, just exhaustion," he told himself. But when he looked back at Margaret, her face was inches from his, and for a heartbeat, it wasn't hers. Her skin smoothed, her lips fuller, her silver hair darkened to a lustrous black. She looked younger, decades younger. Beautiful, terrifyingly beautiful. Ethan froze, his chest heaving. His mind screamed no. But his body betrayed him. He couldn't stop. Margaret's voice deepened into something guttural, almost inhuman. The words she whispered were no longer soft commands, but a chant that pulsed with the rhythm of his heart. The shadows writhed, the fire hissed and spat, and Ethan's vision swam in feverish waves. "Oh God," he gasped, but the sound caught in his throat. "Don't be afraid," she crooned, her fingers gripping his face, her eyes locking him in place. "Give yourself." And he did. Again and again, past exhaustion, past pain, past the point where his muscles screamed for mercy. His body was no longer his. It belonged to her chant, to her hunger, to whatever dark rhythm bound them both. Hours blurred into something endless. Sweat drenched him. His heart thundered. His skin burned hot, then ice cold, then hot again. The wine churned inside him, fueling him far beyond reason. At one point, just before he blacked out, he thought he saw her face shift once more. For the briefest flicker, Margaret wasn't young. She wasn't old. She was something else entirely, something ageless, monstrous, radiant with stolen vitality. And then darkness swallowed him whole. When Ethan woke, he was sprawled across a velvet sofa. His body trembled violently, every muscle raw with agony. His vision blurred. The fire had burned to embers, casting the parlor in eerie shadow. The decanter lay tipped on its side, empty, its last crimson drops soaking into the carpet like dried blood. "Margaret," he croaked. His throat was raw, voice barely audible. No answer. He pushed himself upright, his legs almost buckling. His stomach churned, nausea clawing up his throat. Every bone ached, as though something deep inside had been hollowed out. "Margaret!" he shouted again, louder, his voice cracking. Still nothing. The mansion, once alive with her presence, was silent. Too silent. A wave of dizziness struck him. He staggered toward the hallway, the portraits on the walls glaring down with lifeless eyes. The silence pressed against his skull like a physical weight. And then it began. A faint ache low in his abdomen. Small at first, almost like a cramp. But it spread. Sharper. Stronger. Burning. He stumbled, clutching the wall. His breath quickened, panic rising. By the time he reached the bathroom, the ache had become searing pain. He fumbled for the light switch. The harsh glow filled the room, and Ethan's eyes fell to the mirror. He froze. His reflection looked hollow. His skin gray at the edges, his lips pale, his eyes sunken. But worse, oh God, worse, was what he saw when he looked down. His body, his manhood, swollen, mottled with dark blotches, as though bruised from within. The skin looked sickly, decaying, exuding a foul stench that crawled into his nose and gagged his throat. No, 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 no. Ethan choked, stumbling back from the sink. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The smell was unbearable, sour and metallic. It clung to him, suffocated him. He gripped the counter, sweat dripping down his face, his stomach convulsing with nausea. He gagged, but nothing came. "Margaret!" he screamed again, desperate, broken. Silence. The house was empty. And in that silence, Ethan Cole realized the truth. Whatever had happened last night wasn't passion. It wasn't lust. It was a ritual, and his body was paying the price. The first pale light of dawn crept through the mansion's heavy curtains, slicing across the parlor in muted streaks of gray. Ethan Cole stirred on the velvet sofa, every bone in his body screaming. His mouth was parched, his head throbbed, and his stomach twisted in violent, nauseating spasms. At first, he told himself it was a hangover. Too much whiskey, too much sex, too many hours without rest. But then the smell hit him again. Not faint, not subtle, thick, suffocating. It clung to him like a second skin, crawling into his nose until it coated the back of his throat. Sour, metallic, rotting. He gagged, doubling over, coughing so hard his vision blurred. He gasped for air, his chest heaving, his body trembling. And then realization struck with a force that nearly sent him to his knees. The smell was not coming from the house. It was not the carpets, not the furniture, not the crumbling walls. It was coming from him. He yanked at his clothes with frantic hands, stumbling toward the bathroom. The mirror greeted him with a face he barely recognized. His eyes were hollow, his lips cracked, his skin pale and slick with sweat. He looked less like a man of 25 and more like someone wasting away in their final hours of life. And then his gaze dropped lower. What he saw made him stagger back, one hand gripping the sink for balance. Oh God, no. The flesh between his legs was grotesque, mottled in patches of gray and black, swollen in unnatural shapes. Dark blotches spread like bruises across his skin, and from them oozed a foul stench so pungent it made Bob burn his throat. His body was rotting while he still breathed. Panic tore through him. He clawed at his skin, as if peeling away the decay could undo it, but all he found was pain and more horror. His stomach twisted again, sharp knives of agony stabbing upward into his abdomen. His legs buckled, and he collapsed against the cold tile floor. "Margaret!" he screamed, voice cracking. "What did you do to me?" Silence answered him. Shaking, he dragged himself upright and staggered into the hallway. The mansion loomed in oppressive silence. The parlor was empty, the kitchen pristine, the upstairs rooms immaculate. The bed where she had lain hours ago was perfectly made, the sheets smooth and untouched. No clothes in the closet, no perfume in the air, no toothbrush in the bathroom. It was as though Margaret Halloway had never existed at all. No, no, no. Ethan's voice broke, his cries echoing against the cold walls. You were here. But the house offered nothing back. Desperation clawed at his chest. He stumbled into the foyer, clutching at his stomach as the pain worsened, spreading upward like fire coursing through his veins. His breath rattled, shallow and broken. His vision blurred at the edges, colors melting into gray. His hands fumbled for his phone. It slipped from his slick fingers, clattering to the tile. He scrambled after it, snatching it up with trembling hands. His thumb hit the screen, his breath wheezing. He dialed 3 numbers. 911. What's your emergency? The operator's calm voice was like a rope thrown into stormy seas. Ethan clutched the phone as if it were life itself. Help me, he croaked. His voice cracked, raw with terror. Something's wrong with me. Please, I need help. Sir, slow down. Tell me what's happening. I don't know. Ethan sobbed. My body, it's rotting. Oh God, it's rotting alive. Please hurry. The words tumbled out in broken gasps, his voice barely coherent. He gagged mid-sentence as another wave of stench rolled from his flesh, the foul odor filling his lungs. He choked, coughing, sobbing, trying to speak, but losing words in his panic. Stay with me, sir. Where are you right now? What's your address? He rattled it off through trembling lips, his vision swimming. An ambulance is on the way. Stay on the line. Can you tell me your name? Ethan, he rasped. His lips trembled. His body convulsed. Ethan Cole. Oh God, please. I can't. I can't. His knees buckled, his body collapsing onto the marble floor. The phone slipped from his grasp, clattering against the tiles, the dispatcher's voice distant, fading. His breath came in shallow gasps, his stomach clenching in unbearable pain. He clawed at the floor, dragging himself inch by inch toward the front door, toward the faint promise of daylight seeping through the crack. The house groaned with silence. The wind outside pushed the door back and forth with a soft, taunting creak. The ocean roared beyond the cliffs, indifferent, eternal. And Ethan Cole, once so sure of himself, once so certain he controlled his story, lay writhing in agony, his body betraying him in the most grotesque way imaginable. Somewhere in the back of his fevered mind, one thought screamed louder than the pain, louder than the smell, louder than the horror consuming him. She knew this would happen. Margaret Holloway hadn't been a lover. She hadn't been a lonely widow craving company. She had been a predator. And Ethan had been nothing more than her sacrifice. The sirens were faint in the distance now, growing louder, closer, but he didn't know if he would survive long enough to see them. His world dimmed, the edges of his vision closing in. And still, above everything else, his last conscious thought echoed with sickening clarity. Last night wasn't passion. It was a curse. And by morning, it had begun to devour me alive. The shriek of sirens tore through the dawn as the ambulance skidded into the gravel drive. 2 EMTs burst through the mansion's heavy doors, only to recoil at once. The smell hit them like a wall. Jesus Christ! One gagged, hand clapped over his mouth. The other swallowed hard, forcing himself forward. And there, sprawled across the marble floor, lay Ethan Cole. His body trembled in shallow spasms, his skin slick with sweat, his pants soaked through with a foul, oozing discharge. His once handsome face was pale, lips cracked, eyes rolling with fever. What the hell happened to him? The younger EMT whispered. The older one crouched low, tugging a mask tighter across his face. I don't know, he muttered. But if we don't move fast, he's not going to make it. They strapped Ethan to a gurney. He tried to speak, to warn them, to beg them not to leave him alone, but only a rasp escaped. She did this. The words fell limp on his tongue. Minutes later, the ambulance sped through winding coastal roads. Ethan's body convulsed with each bump, monitors shrieking. The stench inside was so unbearable. One EMT cracked a window, gulping for air as the other barked vitals to the hospital over radio. By the time they wheeled him into the ER at Bar Harbor Regional, chaos erupted. Nurses gagged, pulling masks tighter. Doctors clustered, eyes widening in disbelief at what they saw. His lower body was draped, but the brown-black stains seeping through were impossible to ignore. The skin beneath was necrotizing before their eyes, patches of flesh turning black, sloughing off in grotesque blotches. It was as if death itself had taken root inside him and was spreading outward, minute by minute. Is it infection? Gangrene? A resident stammered. No infection spreads this fast, barked Dr. Henry Lewis, the attending. He snapped on fresh gloves. Get cultures, tox screens, blood work now. And isolate him. I don't want this spreading until we know what the hell we're dealing with. They worked frantically, inserting 4 lines, pushing broad-spectrum antibiotics, fluids, painkillers. Nothing slowed the decay. Ethan writhed on the table, gasping, sobbing, his voice raw. Margaret, 71, his words slurred, delirious. The wine she made me drink. The doctors exchanged confused glances. One nurse whispered, "What wine?" But no one answered. Detective Sarah Langford arrived just after sunrise. A 20-year veteran of the Maine State Police, Sarah had seen it all. Overdoses in cheap motels, bar fights that ended in stabbings, even the occasional gruesome homicide. But nothing prepared her for the sour stench that lingered outside room 12. She pulled her coat tighter, steeling herself as she pushed through the door. On the bed lay Ethan Cole, his face ghostly pale, lips trembling as he tried to form words. His eyes rolled weakly toward her badge. For a moment, something like relief flickered in them. "You're safe," she said gently, crouching at his side. "I'm Detective Langford. I just need you to tell me what happened." He gripped her wrist suddenly, his clammy fingers startlingly strong. "She did this," he rasped. "Margaret, 71. She lives in the mansion by the cliffs. She gave me the wine. She made me." His voice broke into a groan, his body arching in pain. Sarah leaned closer, fighting the urge to gag from the odor rising off him. Margaret who? She pressed. Margaret Holloway, he whispered. She isn't done. She'll find someone else. Please stop her. His grip slackened, his head falling back against the pillow. Nurses rushed in, pushing Sarah aside as alarms blared on the monitors. His heart rate spiked, then plummeted. The team scrambled, shouting orders. Sarah stepped back, her pulse hammering. This wasn't a drug overdose. This wasn't anything she had ever seen. Later that morning, Sarah drove out to the coastal mansion. The iron gates still stood open. The house loomed against the cliffs, its windows dark, its walls soaked in silence. Inside, it felt staged, too clean, too empty. The parlor smelled faintly of smoke, though the fireplace was cold. 2 glasses sat on the mantel. Sarah lifted one carefully with gloved hands. A residue clung to the rim, not quite wine. Fine, dusty. Strange. She slipped it into an evidence bag. Upstairs, the bed was perfectly made. Closets empty. Bathrooms barren. No toothbrush, no perfume bottles, no clothes. Whoever Margaret Holloway had been, she had erased herself overnight. Sarah canvassed the neighbors. An elderly couple, the Dawsons, told her they'd seen young men coming and going for months. Never the same one twice. Some never brought cars. They were dropped off and never seen again. Another neighbor, a fisherman with a whiskey-stained voice, swore he'd heard chanting on windy nights. Like a church service, he muttered, but wrong. Real wrong. Words I couldn't understand. Back at headquarters, Sarah typed Margaret Holloway into every database she had access to. Nothing. No driver's license. No social security record. No property deed tied to the mansion. It was as if Margaret had never existed. But there was something worse. Cold case files. She found 3. Michael Hansen, 2010. Daniel Cross, 2014. Adrian Vega, 2019. Young men. Healthy. All dead within days of unexplained necrosis. All last seen with a silver-haired woman no one could name. Now, Ethan Cole lay rotting in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. Sarah stared at the evidence board in her office, her skin prickling with unease. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just crime. This was a pattern, a predator, and she was still out there. Detective Sarah Langford had dealt with plenty of monsters in her career. Killers who wore human faces, addicts who destroyed their own families, predators who lurked in plain sight. But nothing about Margaret Holloway fit the familiar patterns. No fingerprints, no records, no paper trail. It was as if the woman didn't exist. The only proof was Ethan Cole, and he was slipping away hour by hour. Sarah knew she needed answers beyond police reports. Something about the residue in that wine glass gnawed at her. The lab had already called back with a preliminary analysis. Exotic herbs, alkaloids, and, disturbingly, tiny particles that looked like bone. Human bone. Sarah's gut turned cold. Desperate for context, she reached out to someone outside the usual circle of law enforcement. Dr. Adrian Moreau, a cultural anthropologist from Tuan University who had spent decades studying Caribbean religions and ritualistic practices. If anyone could shed light on what Margaret had done, it was him. They met in a quiet lecture hall, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Sarah slid the evidence file across the table. Moreau adjusted his glasses, scanning the reports. When he reached the note about bone dust, his face paled. "My God," he whispered. "This is Bakar work." Sarah frowned. Bakar. In Haitian Vodou, Moreau explained slowly, a Bakar is a sorcerer. Not a priest serving the spirits, but one who walks both light and dark. They are feared for their ability to bind souls, to command the dead, to make the living less than living. Zombies, if you will. Not the movie kind, but real. Men and women robbed of their essence. Their will, left hollow. Sarah shook her head. "You're saying she poisoned him with magic?" "Not poison," Moreau corrected, leaning forward. "A ritual. Bakars believe the human life force, what they call Ti Bon Ange, can be stolen. Sometimes through powders, sometimes through food, and sometimes through sex." Sarah stiffened. Ethan's broken words echoed in her mind. "She takes it from us. Our manhood. Our life. So you're telling me this woman, Margaret, used some kind of ritual on him to what? Keep herself alive?" Moreau nodded grimly. "It would explain the pattern. 3 young men dead before him. Now Ethan. If she is what I think, she feeds on vitality, on youth, on the very essence of what makes them men. Their strength, their fertility, their energy. Each one buys her time. Sarah exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. The words sounded insane. Nothing she could ever take into court. But the evidence was undeniable. A trail of young men, a vanished woman, a ritualistic residue no lab could explain. Why young men? She asked quietly. Because their life force is strongest, Moreau replied without hesitation. She doesn't want their bodies. She wants their essence, their virility. It's a grotesque form of alchemy. The detective's stomach knotted. She thought of Ethan again, wasting away in that hospital bed, his skin gray, his eyes hollow. A once strong young man reduced to little more than a corpse that still breathed. So what happens to him now? She asked. Moreau's eyes darkened. If she has truly taken his essence, there is no reversing it. His body will continue to rot. The only thing sustaining him is the thread of life she didn't claim. When that thread snaps, he will die. Silence filled the room. Sarah clenched her fists, fury burning beneath her ribs. She had faced killers before, but at least those monsters left fingerprints, left trails, left mistakes she could follow. Margaret Holloway was something else entirely. She killed without knives, without bullets. She left nothing but whispers and corpses that no autopsy could explain. And the most chilling part? She would do it again. Sarah stood, gathering the files, her jaw tight. Then we find her, she said. I don't care if she's 71 or 700. We find her. But as Dr. Moreau closed the folder with a grim sigh, his words followed her like a shadow. Detective, if she truly is what I think she is, then you must understand something. What? You can't catch a ghost. By the end of the week, Ethan Cole no longer looked like Ethan Cole. The young man who once strutted through Portland bars with a cocky grin and a sharp jawline had been reduced to a husk. His skin hung loose and pale, as if the life had been drained from it. His eyes, once mischievous and bright, were sunken into dark hollows. Every breath rattled. Every movement seemed to cost him what little strength he had left. Doctors had amputated below his waist in a desperate attempt to halt the necrosis. But even that hadn't stopped it. The rot was spreading, climbing, eating him alive from the inside out. He was 25. Yet when nurses entered his room, they avoided eye contact because what lay in that bed looked more like a dying old man than someone in the prime of his youth. Detective Sarah Langford visited him often, sometimes at odd hours, unable to let the case go. She found him one night awake, staring out the window at the black sweep of ocean beyond the cliffs. His voice, when it came, was a whisper scraped raw by pain. I keep seeing her, he said without turning his head. Margaret? Sarah asked quietly, pulling a chair closer. He nodded, a faint tremor shaking his jaw. In my dreams. In the glass. She's younger every time. Stronger. Like she took something from me. Like she's wearing it. Sarah's skin prickled, but she steadied her tone. She's just a woman, Ethan. And we will catch her. He turned his head slowly, eyes glassy, a tear streaking his temple. No, he whispered. She's not just a woman. She's something else. And she's still out there. Sarah had no answer. Days passed. His body continued to betray him. Machines beeped steadily at his bedside, tubes snaking into his arms. The smell of decay never left his room, no matter how often the staff tried to mask it with sterile chemicals. Nurses rotated quickly, some gagging behind their masks, others whispering in corners about the boy who was rotting alive. But through it all, Ethan clung to one thing, his need to be heard. One evening, Sarah brought a small audio recorder, placing it gently on the table between them. I need you to tell me again, she said softly. From the beginning. Who she is. What she did. Ethan's cracked lips trembled as he spoke, his voice faint but fierce. Margaret. She said her name was Margaret Holloway. 71. She lived in that big house by the cliffs. She gave me wine. Red. Thick. It didn't taste like wine. After that, it was like my body wasn't mine anymore. I couldn't stop. She whispered things, chants maybe. I didn't know the language. And when I woke up, his voice faltered. His eyes filled with shame. I was already rotting. Sarah let him pause, watching him carefully. This wasn't just a victim recounting a bad night. This was a man unraveling in real time. You're saying she planned this? Sarah pressed. His head jerked in a weak nod. Yes. It wasn't lust. It wasn't passion. It was hunger. She wanted what was inside me. I wasn't a man to her. I was fuel. The words chilled her more than she wanted to admit. Ethan caught her wrist suddenly, surprising her with the strength in his clammy hand. His eyes blazed for one last moment, desperate, pleading. Don't let her disappear, he begged. Promise me. She'll do it again. Find her. End it. Promise me. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight. She nodded. I promise. But even as the words left her lips, doubt gnawed at her. Because how do you promise to catch someone who leaves no trace? Someone who erases herself as easily as smoke in the wind? Ethan lasted only a few days more. His condition worsened by the hour. His words grew fewer, his breaths weaker. Finally, late one night, monitors spiked into frantic alarms before flatlining into an unbroken tone. Nurses rushed in, but Sarah, watching from the hallway, already knew. Ethan Cole, reckless, charming, foolish, and tragically young, was gone. His mother buried him quietly, only a handful of mourners at the graveside. The newspapers wrote about him as just another victim of excess, a cautionary tale of greed and thrill-chasing. But Sarah knew better. She knew Ethan hadn't died of recklessness. He had died of being chosen. And somewhere out there, Margaret Halloway, or whatever her real name was smiling. Detective Sarah Langford had closed countless cases in her career. Murderers behind bars. Families given closure. Answers, however painful, written in neat black ink across case files. But this was no case she could close. No file she could shelve. Because Margaret Halloway wasn't gone. She had vanished. Erased herself. Dissolved like smoke into the night. And the trail she left behind was grotesque. Ethan Cole was dead. Michael Hansen, Daniel Cross, Adrian Vega, all long buried. All young men. All healthy. All reduced to hollow corpses within days of meeting a silver-haired woman who appeared and disappeared at will. And now Ethan's testimony was the only thread Sarah had, the only living voice that dared to whisper the truth. She takes it from us. Our manhood. Our life. But Ethan's voice was silenced. His recording was tucked away, locked in Sarah's drawer. Proof that meant nothing in a courtroom. Words that could never convince a jury. Because how do you prosecute a ghost? How do you catch a legend? Weeks after his funeral, a package arrived at Sarah's desk. No return address. No fingerprints. Just her name, written in looping script across the envelope. Inside was a single item. A crimson silk sash. Folded neatly. The faint scent of wine clinging to its fibers. Sarah's breath caught. Her hands trembled as she slid it into an evidence bag. This wasn't just a token. It wasn't just a taunt. It was a promise. Margaret Halloway wasn't finished. She had shed this town the way a snake sheds its skin. And somewhere, in another city, in another mansion or hotel suite, she was already preparing, already searching, for her next victim. Sarah drove out to the cliffs one evening, the condemned mansion looming dark and empty against the crashing sea. The wind whipped her coat around her legs, the iron gates creaking in protest. To anyone else, it was just another relic of Maine's fading wealth, left to rot in the salt air. But to Sarah, it was a stage where the killer had taken her final bow before slipping into the fog. In Bar Harbor, people whispered. Some swore they'd seen an old woman boarding a bus south, her silver hair tucked beneath a scarf. Others claimed she had been spotted in New Orleans, buying herbs in a market that smelled of rum and smoke. A bartender in Salem told reporters about a mysterious woman who tipped him $100 for a glass of red wine. And every story ended the same. A young man. Vanished. Sarah stared out at the ocean, her jaw clenched. She had promised Ethan she would stop Margaret. But promises didn't catch ghosts. And this predator wasn't like the others. She didn't just kill. She consumed. She erased. She lived on. The Black Widow of Maine. That's what the locals had started calling her. A legend. A curse. A story mothers whispered to sons as a warning. But Sarah knew better. She knew legends are born from truth. And if Dr. Adrian Moreau was right, Margaret wasn't 71 at all. She was far, far older. The waves crashed against the cliffs, ancient and unrelenting. Sarah lit a cigarette, something she hadn't done in years, and exhaled into the wind. Margaret was still out there. Somewhere. Stronger now. Younger. Hungrier. And as Sarah turned away from the mansion, one chilling thought echoed in her mind. A thought that would never leave her, Not in the quiet of her office, not in the stillness of her bedroom, not even in her dreams. She's already hunting again. And maybe, just maybe, tonight, another young man would see her face on a glowing screen, feel the lure of easy money, tell himself it was just one night. And by morning, his body would begin to rot from the inside out.